Welcome to a special episode of Trial Site News. Today we're going to be discussing the CDC's meeting, which discussed vaccine safety updates, COVID-19 hospitalizations, vaccine effectiveness in the United States, and the benefit risk for the COVID-19 vaccines, and more. To do this, we have a guest, Dr. David Wiseman, a former top research bioscientist at Johnson & Johnson who runs his own product research and development business. And to facilitate this discussion, we have Trial Site News founder Daniel O'Connor with us here today. So, gentlemen, welcome and take it away.
Thanks, Adrian. And again, Dr. Wiseman, thank you so much for participating in this discussion today. It's a very important topic.
Thank you for having me.
We're talking about the Centers for Disease Control and their vaccine, their advisory committee on immunization, known as ACIP. And there have been issues, Dr. Wiseman, around transparency practices during the pandemic. There's a lot of people concerned about a number of issues, safety being one of them. But before we get into some of the details, could you maybe take a few moments to talk about transparency? Were they ready to share and have others participate and present their concerns, for example? Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, we've noted, and you've posted different things I've written in the past on your trial site website, where the transparency hasn't been exactly so transparent in various ways, data not being presented fully. But the thing that was, I think, this week was particularly egregious. This meeting today was really the third day of a 3-day meeting. The first 2 days were regularly scheduled meetings that CDC has 3 times a year, and they were talking about other kinds of vaccines, flu, meningococcal, RSV, etc. And this third day was added for COVID. And one of the big things is the issue of public comment. And CDC, and as does FDA, invites public comment, and you have to submit a request by a certain time through a website. And then there's a lottery if there's too many people to speak, et cetera, et cetera. And I applied, as did a number of others, and we got notified 3 days ago whether or not we would be selected. So I got a standard email. Thank you very much. I'm sorry there were too many people to fill the time slots. And thank you very much. Okay, so the first day comes where they have the public comment section, and what was interesting was they only had one session that would cover all 3 days, as opposed to sessions on each day that would be more potentially topic specific. Okay, that's like strike number one, because not everyone's going to be in the room on Tuesday that should be there, or Wednesday that would be there on Friday, today's session, because of different staff members of CDC who are applicable. So it turns out that only 4 people actually spoke in a session that was on the agenda for 30 minutes. Well, that only took about 13 minutes. And I found out from Bree Dressen, the founder of the React 19 group, that she knows of 30 people who applied to speak. So if they had plenty of people who could have filled the slots, and yet they didn't do them. So it looks like they were actively shutting down the vaccine injured people. I don't know who else got to apply, but that was particularly egregious. And so we tweeted about that, and you amplified the tweet, and there's been about 160,000 views on that. So that was sort of one thing. Another, these are all small little things, but they're big things, was that when they post the slides, the presentation slides, they normally do it well in advance. But I've noticed for the COVID presentations, they only post them as the meeting is going to start. Well, today that wasn't even the case. It took them over an hour for that to happen, and I had to write them an email to do that. So these are all concerns that just degrade transparency.
Sorry to interrupt, but are you saying that the typical courtesy period of providing and function of providing presentations in advance or even right before the meeting didn't even occur?
For the other kinds of vaccines, they were there at some point before the meeting, maybe the day before, maybe hours before. But for the COVID ACIP meetings that I've attended in the last year or year and a half, they typically don't put them up until literally the meeting's about to start.
Right.
And then one or two they don't even put up until that particular person is about to start. But today, nothing got put up until at least an hour or so, hour and a half, maybe into the meeting. I did send them an email, whether they posted it because of my email or what, I have no idea. But it's just some people, you need to be able to look at things on your screen and to digest things and sometimes go back and forth and they're not helping people. It's a small point, Daniel, but it's a big point. But I want to talk about transparency, because I think there was a very, 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 very notable comment from Dr. Grace Lee, who was the chairperson of this meeting, and it was so unusual that it is particularly noteworthy, and a number of the speakers, a number of the members of the committee were talking about the need to have credible data that they can share with the public, that the CDC can share with the public to reduce hesitancy. And you know the number, Daniel, that only 16% of the people who are eligible to receive the boosters have actually received them, and that number is even lower in the lower age groups, going down to the very small children, less than 5%, less than 1% of those eligible. And this was a recurring theme, okay? And Dr. Lee said something of the kind that Pfizer was asked, are you doing certain kinds of studies? Because we need randomized studies, we need studies, because they all recognize that the data that's being used to justify the bivalence is basically extrapolative data from BA1 variants and other animal data and so on, okay? And they really, then Pfizer was asked about a study, and Pfizer said, well, we've got 180 people, 90, I think, in each group. And Dr. Lee, the chairperson of this ACIP, right, said on two occasions, once at that time, once to wrap up the meeting, even though that number may satisfy a statistical criteria, we need to think about how this helps vaccine acceptance. Okay, she said, I want to be able to support a meaningful statement concerning the safety and efficacy of the vaccine program. This was the chairman of the meeting of the ACIP. And I think for her to say that was absolutely stunning, right? Because the message, I think, is getting across. We need to show us the data. And that's what we've been talking about for a year and a half, 2 years. FDA, Pfizer, Moderna, in a number of areas have not been forthcoming with data. The data has been very poor, inadequate, small numbers, not enough follow-up. Go down the list. There's all sorts of things. And here we're talking about going to a primary series of the current bivalence, which is a whole nother question if that's even a good idea, right? And based on what? Based on what data? And Pfizer said we've got 180 patients and the data may not be ready for months. I can't understand why 180 patients takes you months. Okay, and neither can Dr. Lee, and neither can Dr. Lee. That's absolutely stuff. So you asked me about transparency. I think the message is getting through, even to Dr. Lee. That's stunning.
So what you've shared is material. I have a quick question. So, and just to repeat, for all of us and our audience, that is that the CDC is purposely being less transparent with the COVID vaccines than other vaccines. They're not giving people a chance to review presentations. They're not allowing people to present or express their concerns. There's a real problem there. Now, I have a question.
And Daniel, it's not only the number of people, it's that there was on today's session, there was no public session at all. So the people who needed to hear this in the context of the discussion, from vaccine injured or whoever, it's like, oh, it doesn't exist. We're not even going to talk about it today. I mean, that's particularly egregious, and the manipulation of saying, well, we didn't have enough people or whatever. I don't know, but there's an article that you'll point to in the chat somewhere when you post this that I wrote on that subject. So yes, there's that aspect, but what I'm saying, I think that's hugely egregious. But in another respect, what Dr. Lee was saying about the data from FDA and Pfizer, Moderna, that's supporting these, claims, that she said we've got to have transparency, we've got to have data here.
So on that note, just to repeat one other point, and then I'm going to ask you a quick question before we get into the session. There's the bivalent booster dose, which didn't go through clinical trials by the time they released it on the market. The studies had just barely started, or may have not even started yet. Only 16% about of the population has opted to receive that vaccine. So clearly the market consumers are concerned, clearly. Now,
16, let's be clear.
Yeah, 16%.
Yeah.
Now, a question I have for you, the bivalent booster dose that, again, the government's saying we got to get it. Nobody wants it. Have they shared any clinical trial data yet? Has that study been done at all? Is there any data that's come from that study that they said, yes, look, see, it's working, or not?
Right. So there have been a couple of observational studies that CDC have done.
No, I know that. No, I don't mean that, David. I mean the clinical trials, the bivalent.
No, not from the companies, no.
Okay, so that's a problem. Okay. I understand the observational studies, and we talked about that before, and there's real problems with those observational studies. It's from the Vision Network, various real-world networks that CDC has it's not randomized data. You can't cite evidentiary claims from that data by itself. Okay, so with that being said, let's get into safety. So you're at the ACIP meeting, and they talk about safety.
Okay.
What did you learn? Were there any discrepancies between what you've learned through your reviews and analysis versus what they're declaring?
Right. So that to me was a hugely. I'm just going to put my screen up. I'm going to jump to those slides. This is the number, by the way, Daniel, that you say 0.2% of under 2-year-old children who were eligible, only 0.2 have received the bivalent vaccine. That goes up to 11% in the 24-year-olds, and then higher for the older categories.
Yeah.
Okay, let me show you. So here's one thing. So let's talk about. I'll do myocarditis first because it's relatively quick to do, and then I'll go into other things. So they're talking about myocarditis with the bivalents, okay? And they're showing on this slide. I'm not going to try and explain everything, but they're trying to say, well, look, the bivalent incidents that we're getting from VSD, one of the monitoring systems, is very, very low. Okay, there's zero incidence. We're not seeing any myocarditis in 12 to 17-year-olds, which is the place where you want to look. And they're saying, well, the numbers are small and so on and so forth. Yeah, but here's the problem with that. I just showed you a moment ago that there's a very small percentage of the people who are eligible to receive the doses who could have received them. So A, few people have done so, and B, they're selecting out. Someone who had myocarditis in the first primary series is not going to go and get a third vaccine of any kind. So this is highly subject to selection bias. This is and they're not even recognizing that as a problem. So it's like they're looking, but they're closing their eyes while they're looking. So that's a huge problem here. Okay, all right, that's bad enough. That's bad enough. But now let's talk about this one. Okay, we're going to talk about ischemic stroke here. Okay, and this came up as a signal a few weeks ago. This was discussed at the FDA VRBPAC meeting of about a month ago. And now this is an update. And I'm going to show you 4 different segments and 4 presentations. They spent over an hour on this easily. Okay. And they're saying that in the COVID mRNA bivalent booster doses, look at the first one. No unusual or unexpected reporting patterns were observed. The signal that they saw has gone away now, right? It was there for a little bit, and now it's gone away. Okay, I'm not going to go into the maths of that. It doesn't matter. But look, we looked in all these other places. We looked at VAERS, right? We looked at VAERS. We looked at the VA system. We looked at international regulatory partners. No evidence of a safety signal in Pfizer's. All over the place. We've looked everywhere, and we can't find a signal. It seems to have gone away. And that's Dr. Shimabukuro from CDC. Now I'm going to show you the similar slide from Dr. Forshi, who's from FDA, And he's basically saying they've got a slightly different way of looking at it, but they didn't see any excess reports in VAERS, in other databases, et cetera. We didn't do anything, but we didn't find anything, but we're still going to do a formal epidemiologic study to look at this more closely. That's so that we have CDC and we have FDA. Now we have a group which is a sort of a subcommittee called the VAS, Vaccine Safety Technical Group, I think it stands for. And look at what they say: no increased ratio for ischemic stroke, and previous surveillance in VSD and other US systems found no evidence of increased risk. So that's 3 people saying we've looked everywhere, we can't find it. And there's another person that spoke up, Dr. Twentyman, right? And she's also saying no other VSD signals have found and hasn't come up in other safety systems. And here's what we're going to conclude. Look at the bottom sort of panel. They remain confident in current COVID vaccine recommendations, that we don't have to change any recommendations whatsoever, and so on. So now we have 4 different presentations saying, yeah, there's something there, maybe we'll keep looking at it, but nothing to worry about. Okay, but we didn't find it anywhere else, including VAERS. Now look at this. Look at this, Daniel. Look at this. There was a FOIA, Freedom of Information request disclosure made about a month ago, a bit more than a month ago. And I have abstracted from the Excel files that were provided the ischemic stroke. And you can look at whether it's all events or just serious events, it doesn't matter. And if you look at the very bottom line there, it says ischemic stroke. And the key and the number to look at is the number in the yellow in the 1, 2, 3, 4th column, fifth column. It says PRR. That's a safety signal number. And you see on the top panel, it's 4.83. The bottom panel is 2.64. The magic number to qualify as a signal, again, a signal doesn't prove causality. It's a signal, okay? Yes. But the magic number is 2. So if it exceeds 2, then that's a potential signal, combined with a different magic number, which is the number to the left of that, which is this thing called a chi-square number, and that has to exceed 4. We'll look at the top panel, it's 103, and the bottom panel is 29.95. So in both of those cases, this signal exceeds what is called the Evans criteria. There's also more than 3 of them that are occurring. Look at there's hundreds of them potentially, right? And that exceeds what is called the Evans criteria. That is called a signal. That is what is in the SOP for the VAERS system that the CDC and FDA put out a couple of years ago. That is a signal.
Dr. Wiseman, I see that. Now, this data here, is this being pulled from VAERS?
This is VAERS, and this is CDC's analysis of VAERS using this PRR methodology that they were required to disclose. They were required to do it according to their standard operating procedure, but they hadn't disclosed it until a FOIA request, asked them to disclose it. So this is CDC doing the calculation. This is not me doing the calculation. Okay, this is CDC's calculation, and you can calculate it. It comes out the same number, but this is CDC's calculation. Both of these. Okay, so when they said we looked everywhere in VAERS, and the previous slide said we didn't just look for bivalents, we looked at monovalents, we looked at any place that had anything to do with mRNA vaccines, we didn't find anything. We didn't find any signals anywhere. And look at this. There's a signal here.
For the audience, what would be, so 2 is the number that anything under 2 would be considered not a signal?
Well, not necessarily, but just by and I'll show you in a moment where I'm going to violate that rule a little bit, okay? But basically the criteria that was set up 20 years ago by Dr. Evans in England and that everyone's using is the PRR number has got to be 2 or more, and the chi-square number has got to be 4 or more. Okay, if it's 1.6, okay. So I'm going to show you one other slide or 2 other slides. One second. Because this is the CDC doing this calculation. Now I'm going to show you.
I guess show me. Then I have a question. My question is going to revolve around: is it possible that they could bury that data that you just showed us in a aggregate analysis?
Well, they said they didn't find it anywhere. I guess if you want to bury it, you can bury it by just saying it doesn't exist. I mean, there's lots of ways of saying you can bury it. I have no idea, but okay, I'm going to show you another place. Okay, this is a paper that was published about a year ago, I think, and the work was sponsored by sports. You can see in the bottom there, supported by NIH, an NIH grant, and one of the people on the paper was from the NIH, the Dr. Huffman, I guess, or no, Dr. Lin, I think it was. Okay, so this is a work that was published in the journal Vaccine, and the work was sponsored by, supported by NIH. Okay, and what they've done, they've actually produced a website. The URL is shown over there, and you can go to this website, and this is what the output looks like, and you can choose a vaccine, and you can choose a side effect, and it will calculate this PRR number for you. And it does it maybe a slightly different way to the other way, but it's basically it's not a bad way, and it's a bit small to see, but the key number is there. If you look at about halfway down, if you see my cursor, chi-squared test result. Sorry, the bit above there.
2.357.
2.35, and chi-square is 93. Now, the smoke and mirrors that they've done is they've said this doesn't qualify as a signal, because the reason they've added a third criteria which never existed anywhere, including in the VAERS standard operating procedure, that it has to have a number of cases that exceeds 0.2%. That's a ridiculous criteria to add in. It makes absolutely no sense, and it doesn't appear anywhere else. So we're going to ignore that. But in all other respects, the PRR for Pfizer is more than 2, and the chi-square is 90 something with a p-value of 10 to the minus 16. Okay, that's highly significant. That's Pfizer, and on the next slide is actually Moderna, which speaks to your earlier question. The PRR there is only 1.6, but the chi-square is 24 with a very highly significant PRR value, because we're dealing with hundreds of events here. So a 60% increase in the rate of this event is significant when you're dealing with hundreds of events. The system of PRR was designed to pick up very small changes, let's say from 4 to 8, from 5 to 10, which you would need a chi-square of 4, but or a p, or whatever. But here we're dealing with hundreds of events. So I'm not going to discount that as a signal. But the point is, it's all consistent. And so here you have 4 people: CDC, FDA, Dr. Twentyman, Dr. Who was the other one? Talbot, I think it was, right? All saying we looked in multiple places, there's nothing to look at, we're going to continue monitoring, but we didn't find anywhere else, including in VAERS and including with monovalents. And look, right here, you've got CDC's own analysis, and you've got a different analysis on VAERS also, but supported by NIH. There's a signal here, okay? I don't...
Well, on that note, Dr. Wiseman, so on that note, so they're clearly ignoring or avoiding certain data points from certain repositories, okay?
Right.
Now, was that could have been, an oversight? Is it intentional? If it's intentional, that's a real problem, okay? That's a real problem. This is a form of manipulation that what they are doing, if what you're saying is accurate, and it surely looks that way, they are being very selective with what data they show, and then they're making essentially what are false statements that they've looked everywhere and they can't find any signal. So now this data here, this shows that there is some signal. Is this data from all real world? Is there any parameters around this data?
So repeat that. Is it from
the data that's coming from this analysis? Is this just all the VAERS data? Is this?
This is all VAERS. This is VAERS. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So has this data been? You know how they will say that not everything in VAERS is potentially.
I understand that, but we understand what the limitations of all these systems have limitations, but they have VAERS. They're not saying in general VAERS is rubbish because they're using it. They're saying we looked in VAERS and we didn't find it. Okay, if you would have found it, okay, so you said, okay, we found a signal, it's PRR value, this, that, or the other. Okay, now go and discuss it. Now say, oh, we found it in 2 places, but they've done other studies, and there's a whole story that was presented today why they didn't think it was a problem. They did different kinds of analyses and so on. Okay, that's legitimate to do, but don't tell me we only found it in 1 place. We found it in another place. And two different groups, a CDC group and an NIH group, both found it in that other place.
And I think
if it's wrong, then discuss why it's wrong, but don't say it doesn't exist.
I think the problem here, Dr. Wiseman, is that you have a pattern of obfuscation, a pattern of opaqueness, of avoiding transparency. You have the Dr. Lee essentially calling out for more transparency. It would appear that these folks are continue to try to run what is a fraudulent type of effort. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, what's your theory here? Why are they doing this? Why don't they be a little bit more candid, transparent, and open? This data is out there.
Listen, Daniel, I can't. All I can tell you is this is the numbers. I don't know what their motivation is. I can't get inside their head. I wasn't present in secret meetings if they existed or whatever. Okay, I have no idea. So I don't know if it's fraud. You know, you're the lawyer. I'm not. I don't know if it meets the standard for the word criminal definition of the word fraud. I have no idea. But all I can tell you is from a scientific point of view, you make a statement that we didn't find it anywhere, and boom, here it is. Okay, whatever you want to call that. It's certainly scientifically incorrect. Okay, that's what I can tell you. You lawyers figure out what legal term to use. I'm just giving you the scientific term.
Understood. Were there any other safety data points that caught your attention in this recent meeting?
Well, no, these were the only ones really discussed. You know, they certainly didn't go into any of the other potential things that we talked about, neurologic disease things, clotting, and all those other things. This was the focus of the safety discussion. Okay.
So, well, that's very helpful. We really appreciate this clarity. We know this data. It's valid. It's real. We'll have to investigate why this particular data set was not included. Let's talk a little bit about vaccine effectiveness, especially for the bivalent, which they really haven't had a scientific data source. They've had a couple observational survey type of data sources that they've used to try to approximate effectiveness. What was their position on vaccine effectiveness for the bivalent Omicron BA4, BA5 booster?
Well, it was ambivalent, if I can use that. You like that? It was ambivalent, if you will. But they didn't realize that. On the one hand, they said, okay, we don't have all the data, and we've got this observational data that CDC have generated, and so on. They presented those. They showed that there was waning. They said, look, we've got insufficient time to look at waning, insufficient time to look at the effect of new evolutionary evolutions in the virus. So they recognize that that's a problem there. But at the same time, they'll say, oh, yes, but it remains the most effective way of reducing disease, blah, blah, blah. That's their mantra. But they're trying to then piggyback on these antibody testing systems that are used to say, oh, we've got this number of antibodies and so on and so forth, to say there's evidence for good antibody formation. What they haven't said clearly, and this was in the document I posted to the CDC comments, which is linked in the document I put up on trial site the other day. It was also in my comments to the CDC, the FDA meeting, is there's now a slew of these papers that have come out to show that the XBB 1.5 and the BQ 1.1, which are now the prevailing, well, the XBB 1.5 is like 89%, I think, of the prevailing strains in the United States. Okay, that there's significant escape from that. And so on the one hand, they recognize that's a problem. The other hand, they don't recognize it's a problem. It's like they're trying to walk a tightrope, but they can't figure out that the two different things are incompatible. That's why I call it ambivalent, because they have two different values, of what they're saying. So
Yes.
since you can't really calculate efficacy, you don't know what the efficacy is, because all those studies that were done, the observational studies that the CDC have produced in the last few weeks, even at best those estimates for regular diseases 20, 30, 40%. Okay, maybe it's higher for severe disease. Okay, but those have waned, and those were at periods where there wasn't as high incidence of XBB as we have today. So they recognize this as a problem, and then they still think that using Wuhan, which is completely extinct, using BA5, which is an incidence today on CDC's website of 0.1%, that's going to be helpful by the time FDA come out with their recommendation. And that's actually another surprising part in this story. FDA had their meeting 4 weeks ago. They said, well, what new variants do we need to use the bivalent vaccine as a primary series? I would have thought by now FDA would have authorized that. For some reason, they haven't. And FDA was asked that question. The head of the vaccine group, the Dr. Kozlar, I think his name is, was asked that. And he gave a very short answer. He said, well, basically, we're still working on it. Really? That's all you have to say? Everyone wants to know what's going on. Why are we still working with monovalent Wuhan? And he gave a non-answer. Something's going on, Danny. I don't know why FDA are dithering. If these bivalent vaccines are so good, why aren't we
So David, I have a question on that. The bivalent booster, is that technically authorized under emergency use authorization?
Yeah.
Or licensed? And
no, it's definitely not. It's definitely not licensed. That's for sure. It's only in the US. It's not. It's not. Doesn't have a BLA.
If you read the FDA's website, they have it listed under the licensure framework. And so, we did an article, and it was confusing. It's very confusing.
Okay, I'll be happy to read it. I don't recall seeing your article, but I certainly don't recall seeing anything from FDA. So we have now fully authorized, fully approved. It means given a BLA license for these bivalent vaccines.
It may have been because
to hear that.
Yeah, we'll follow up on that. That's something to follow up on for the audience. Now, okay, going back, making good use of time here, going back to the effectiveness, we have very few people, except for the elderly. 40% of those that were above 65 did opt to receive the vaccine, and it kind of makes sense if individuals feel if individuals are more vulnerable, it might make more sense, in that cohort. Was prior infection and natural immunity raised in this meeting in terms of credible proxy for protection?
Right, that's a very good. That came up in a number of places. It came up just to preview that when FDA put out their briefing document for the meeting a month ago, the VRBPAC meeting, about what might happen in the future. They did discuss the possibility that if people had prior infection, it would be as good as having an immunization. Now, would that mean if they had a prior infection, they would only need one shot instead of two shots? They couldn't decide. And so that was, they really didn't discuss it much at the FDA, but it was in their briefing document. Fast forward till today, and the subject came up again. And again, it was all over the place. The bottom line is we don't know. Okay, the bottom is they don't know. Everyone's highly confused. They realize there's a lot of studies that need to be done and that no one really fully understands. They recognize that there is high seroprevalence, that there's recognized that there's a high contribution of natural immunity, and what will be the recommendations despite the science is complicated, because they're also grappling with being able to produce a guideline that is simple. right now the guidelines have sort of morphed and had bits and pieces added to them over the last year and a half, 2 years, and they've become very unwieldy. So there's a need to simplify anyway for lots of reasons, which is good, the recommendations. So they said, well, are we going to base it on, someone said, well, should we ask someone to get antibody testing? And depending on their antibodies, that would determine whether or not they would need a vaccine and so on. So the question remains open. It's certainly, the good news is we do recognize that there's a contribution of natural immunity. Exactly how that's going to be managed, they still really don't understand.
Right. It makes sense. And I'm looking at your limitations. I mean, the bottom one's very clear, that they don't know what the rates of myocarditis is in bivalent boosters because they don't have enough data, and studies are underway.
So this presentation by Dr. Wallace, well, I think it was the penultimate presentation, talking about the benefit and risk. So they were trying to calculate a risk-benefit ratio, and they really can't, because the only risk that they were imputing was the myocarditis. We already talked about why that's particularly biased and flawed. Okay, and then to calculate what the benefit is, we can't even do that because we don't have any clinical data. Dr. Daly said we need it. Dr. Lee says we need it. Everyone says we need it. Okay, and so you can't even calculate a risk benefit. And one of the, I'm not sure I would call it a requirement, but one of the elements of the FDA guidance on these emergency use situations is that they should be calculating a risk benefit ratio of the potential risks and benefits weighed against the potential and actual potential and known risks against the potential and known benefits. And if you don't know either, then you're completely shooting in the dark. And that's the problem. We're completely shooting in the dark with a vaccine that's basically irrelevant now from an extinction point of view. We haven't even talked about the toxicity and the molecular biology, that there's new pharmacology going on there. That's a whole nother story that never even got to this discussion, right? And FDA surprisingly said, well, we're still working on it. It's amazing. Why, if this is so important, why are you still working on it? You should have figured this out by now. So there was no one really could come up with a risk benefit. But here's a slide from Dr. Oliver that again I think encapsulates one of the problems they're getting, that there's this thing called message fatigue. People are tired of this. They're tired of hearing we've got to have boosters. We don't have to do boosters. There's XBB, there's Omicron, and there's so on and so forth. So they know they can't get away with getting boosters every 2 minutes. Right. Maybe we'll do it once a year. So maybe they're trying to sort of hedge, cut their losses and say, okay, we can't foist a new vaccine on people. If we wait till June and September, okay, people may take it once a year, but we've got a lot of messaging to figure out. And even Dr. Lee, in that comment that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion today, I think was so telling, that even with all the transparency stuff that we've been talking about, I think slowly, the message is getting in. We need data here, okay? And just you think you can get away with 6 mice, 8 mice, and a study with 90 people? People aren't buying it. The market is not buying it. 16% of the people only have taken the booster vaccine, and in a lot of ages, not hardly anyone.
I agree, Dr. Wiseman. And your input, your observation, and your wisdom is valued by a lot of people. I can assure you that. Let's talk about the next set of meetings. FDA, CDC. If you were their advisor, if they would magically start listening to you. Okay, just imagine for a minute.
Now you're really fantasizing, Daniel. Now you're in fantasy land.
I'm fundamentally an optimistic person. Now, assuming they would, what would be your advice for the next FDA and ACIP meetings when it comes to COVID vaccines?
Well, I'll tell you what. I'm gonna tell you what FDA and Anthony Fauci say about this. Okay, you don't have to listen to me. Okay, I will answer your question, but before I do that, I'm gonna show you on the next slide, an answer that I will basically support. Okay, so this is the mantra at the bottom. This is Sarah Oliver. She's like the quarterback of all this.
Okay.
This mantra, COVID vaccines, despite all the limitations that we talked about that they put on their slides, COVID vaccines continue to be the most effective tool we have to prevent serious illness, hospitalization, and death. Based on what? Based on all the limitations, they're still saying that. Okay, that's the CDC. CDC is still saying that. Okay, now look at who we look at. Peter Marks. Peter Marks, for those who don't know, he is the head of the, he is not the head of the FDA, but he's the next level down. And under him are all the vaccine, regulatory functions. And this is a paper he wrote in JAMA, Journal of the Medical Association, December the 9th, so very recently, right? Continuing along the current path of generation administration of variant-specific vaccine boosters is inadequate as a long-term strategy. Okay, that's Peter Marks. We have to look at the development of a distinctly improved generation of vaccines offering longer protection. It will require simply more than making incremental modifications on the current generation of vaccines. Okay, thank God someone's saying it. Why isn't the rest of the FDA saying this? Why isn't the CDC saying this? Okay, but if you don't like Peter Marks, let's look at the third gentleman on this author list, a gentleman called Anthony S. Fauci. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Oh, yes. We just wrote an article about this,
Yeah, I don't know if you heard of him. Look at this. Look at this. These are his words, not mine. He's talking about viruses, including SARS-CoV-2, blah, 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 have not to date been effectively controlled by licensed or experimental vaccines. Yeah. I mean, that is a stunning admission. SARS-CoV-2 has not effectively, we heard the word, we're getting this word safe and effective ran down our throat at every turn of the web, right? Have not been effectively controlled by license. Unbelievable. And then he says, oh, it's not that surprising because of blah, blah, blah reasons, mucosal respiratory infections, etc. How can we expect vaccines, especially systemically administered non-replicating viruses, vaccines to do so? We wouldn't expect them to do very well. Well, duh, why have we been working on for 2 years? It is not surprising that none of the predominantly mucosal respiratory viruses, of which SARS-CoV-2 is one, have been effectively controlled by vaccines. Okay, so if that is not clear to everyone, without having to listen to
David, Dr. Wiseman, remember what they're saying. When they first came out with the promotions for this product, the fundamental underlying assumption was that these vaccines would control the pandemic. That was all the messaging. That's why WHO and the NIH Fauci shot for the 70% vaccination rate. They were very overt and explicit. This is going to get us to herd immunity. They changed their positioning around early spring 2021 when it became very clear that these were not neutralizing vaccines whatsoever. So the messaging changed to be, we're doing this to reduce hospitalization and death. Now, what they're saying here, this doesn't contradict with what Fauci has been saying. What he's saying here doesn't contradict with what he's saying with the current vaccines. What he's saying with the current vaccines is they will reduce the probability of serious illness or mortality. What he's saying here, if we want to control these viruses, meaning make the vaccines neutralizing, then we have to come up with the next generation. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, parts of your sentence I agree with, but I wouldn't put the sentence together in the same way that you did. So this is one of the goalpost moving, things that's been going on, is that, in the indication for the vaccines, I don't remember the exact wording, but it's something like, this vaccine will reduce symptomatic COVID disease or something like that. I can't remember the exact word. Okay, it doesn't say this vaccine reduces serious outcomes, hospitalization, and death. Okay, that's a different. In a normal world on a normal day, right? You're a drug company and you have your new drug. Okay, those are two different claims. One is we reduce symptomatic disease. The other one is we reduce serious disease, however you want to say that. Okay, so they've been trying to morph to the, oh yes, if it doesn't work very well, vaccine efficacy wanes, it even goes negative at some points, but don't worry, it could be much worse. And now we've got these serious outcome measures that have only been tested in observational studies with all those problems, okay, that they're now admitting to, right? And so if that's true, then change the indication. They haven't changed the indication. So again, it's one of these cases they're having their cake and trying to eat it, okay? And so it's not really answering your question, but I'm just trying to lay out exactly what happened here, so people understand what they're now saying is a movement of a goalpost.
And Dr. Wiseman, I'm not really disagreeing with you. I was sort of just playing devil's advocate.
No, I get it. That's okay. That's fine.
But I agree. The goalpost has been moving. They're not being candid about that. You know, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't. The science doesn't register. You know, we're looking at the numbers constantly. So I think, you know, your point is well taken. My question to you was, what would you advise to them? And they're basically disclosing to the world your advice.
Well, I mean, it goes. So, I mean, what we haven't talked about. I mean, obviously, you know, everything that Dr. Lee was saying, that we need the data, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be credible. The messaging needs to be credible. You know, you can't move the goalpost. I mean, people are tired of this stuff, and I think that's why one of the reasons, not the only reason, why there's such low uptake. And the other thing to mention, there was an article in Nature a couple of months ago, this one over here, saying that the vaccination rates in general for all vaccines or many other vaccines has gone down because there's been a undermining of public confidence in the public health institutions. And so this is not, we're not just talking about COVID here. You know, we're talking about the knock-on effect on all other vaccines. So I think there's got to be a really, really serious discussion about how to reinstill confidence in the public health institutions. And just by having the same guys trying to figure out on their own is never going to happen, because they don't see the wart on the end of their own nose. Okay, they've got to have other people and engaging people like me who are willing to give them honest feedback. I don't have anything personal against any of these people. Okay, I mean, I know there are people who are like that, but I don't. All right. I just think they're misguided for all sorts of reasons. I mean, were they well intentioned? I think they were well intentioned, but it hasn't turned out so well. And so we've got to have a real serious discussion. That some of the confounding things came out today, because the Dr. Romero, who is now the head of I think they call it division or the center within CDC that's dealing with respiratory diseases, his introductory remarks a couple of days ago, he said, it's very hard to distinguish between COVID, RSV, influenza. And statistically, this is a nightmare. We haven't really grappled with this problem. But all these studies, especially all these observational studies, we really don't know who these people are, what they've got COVID, they have been excluded for influenza, and the data is multiply confounded. They also talked about the underreporting of immunization. So that's a huge problem in all of these studies, how they're calculated. There's mass. So one part of the advice would be, guys, you've got to get your act together. You've got to have improved reporting systems for immunization and tracking and linked systems like they do in Denmark. But fundamentally, we've got to look at how these vaccines were approved in this very fast way. You've seen this quote from Dr. Janssen, who retired recently from being the head of the vaccine group at Pfizer. This is in Nature. We flew the airplane while we were still building it. Okay, this is clearly was not a good idea. Okay, and so we've got multiple questions about the molecular biology. We know that there are heterotrimers. There are these new hybrid spike proteins that are being produced by these bivalent vaccines. Moderna says so. Okay, we know, we've looked at my colleagues. We've looked at the European documents about how the Pfizer bivalent vaccine is made, and we have every reason to believe that these heterotrimers exist in the Pfizer vaccine. We know from the React 19 group, who spoke with Peter Marks in December, that he admits acknowledges that there are heterotrimers. That is new chemistry, new pharmacology, potentially new toxicology. We've got issues of what is the DNA spillover from the plasmid production part of the story that gets into the vaccines, and what are the consequences for that? What are the consequences of having spike protein everywhere for up to 4 months that there's data on, at least that's circulating, not just the few days that the CDC were talking about. So if they want to instill confidence in the system, they've got to address all of these systems. So my advice is, guys, you've got to start talking to us. You've got to sit down, because this is only going to get worse. Okay, yeah. That's the first thing. We can go into all the details. Okay, and we're going to talk about repurposed drugs. We're going to talk about, go down the list of transparency and so on and so forth. But all of this stuff has got to be dealt with, because if we don't, we're going to be in even bigger trouble than we may be shortly. Fortunately, only a few people have had the boosters, and we may be, and that may have allowed enough people to recover their immune function, because we've got evidence once the vaccines go into negative efficacy territory. CDC's data show that. Other people show that. Once we go into negative efficacy territory, okay, it is an indication that there perhaps is a compromise of the immune system. And there's all sorts of weird stuff that's showing up. Why is there an explosion of respiratory diseases that are happening in the last couple of months? They don't understand it. Perhaps it's because there's immune compromise, and that's why there's more influenza or RSV or whatever it is.
We don't know. We can't know. We have to be careful, right? There's a lot of claims that are made out there that
we don't know, but we have to ask the question.
100% agree with you. Dr. Wiseman, on that front, I think, we plan on having more of these as FDA has more meetings, as CDC ACIP has more meetings. We'd like to invite you on to discuss these as well. We like to think that this is sort of a record that we're building over time. We are concerned. We agree with you that these questions need to be asked. And we hope that, over time, we have some influence over this whole process, and that, our government, agencies, academia, that they start to get a little bit more critical and, essentially force more accountability, like Dr. Lee was kind of applying for. Any concluding thoughts before we wrap it up for today?
I hope Dr. Lee's remarks are the beginning of a major turnaround. I was pleasantly stunned by those remarks, and I have been critical of her, and and I believe that she's deserved it. But you have to give credit where credit is due, and she came out with a couple of statements which I thought were stunningly positive, at least in terms of thinking. And my hope that will infect other people, as it were, in the committee and in the CDC and so on, and the FDA, and that's my hope. So I'm trying to leave it on a positive note, if I can.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time, Dr. Wiseman, and we will definitely invite you back on to discuss these meetings as they unfold.
Thank you.